Thanks so much for having me today. And I'm glad you introduced. I have to tell everyone that I'm from Trinidad, from the Caribbean, before my talk, because people have said that they missed the first 10 minutes trying to guess where I was from. So now that you all know, I guess I have your full attention. So as Megan mentioned, what I'm going to talk about today is really a research approach that I think many of you can use, which is to say, how do we take any piece of technology and keep perpetually improving it by reimagining randomized experiments so that we can make them collaborative and constantly improve resources. And I should also mention that I'm part of this institute, AllSet, so you can see the link to the website there. So AllSet is the Institute for the Application of Learning Sciences and Educational Technology. And so they're at National University of Singapore, and they're especially excited about collaborations with leaders in the area like UniSA. Whether there are ways to think about organizing shared initiatives around bringing research to bear on on-campus education, whether it's online settings, and that's one reason why they kind of took on Sasha Poquet as a postdoc from UniSA. So, like many of you, I'm really excited about the promise of software to enhance learning. Right now, anyone can go online to something like a MOOC, and they could start beginning to learn machine learning. For example, they could watch videos, or they could attempt problems and get feedback in real time about what they do and don't know. And it's increasingly impacting our on-campus learning. Like here at UniSA, you put many courses online. So it's actually impacting students who are learning as part of their professional degree. I also see that learning cannot just help education and career development, but I think about learning a lot more broadly. For example, how do we tackle mental and physical health issues, like getting people to deal with depression or quit smoking? Methods like cognitive behavior therapy are so effective that in the UK, doctors can actually write a prescription for online cognitive behavior therapy. And some of the leaders in this area actually come from Australia. So I won't talk as much about it, but I've also worked on how do we actually teach people skills like cognitive behavior therapy so they can learn to manage stress and their emotions to be more productive. But we have a problem. No matter how well you design them, resources for learning always need improvement. When we actually measure learning outcomes, a lot of online resources aren't giving people what they need, or many activities don't actually change people's behavior. And I don't think it's because we haven't designed these well. I think it's the classic problem you face in human-computer interaction. We can't actually predict what works in the real world until we actually deploy it and we can collect data. So we have a problem here. We need to find a way that we can deploy these online courses or deploy on-campus resources in a way that after they go out to students, we can keep improving and enhancing them. And so the vision I'd like to work towards is systems that perpetually improve, just like a real teacher. If you think of an online problem that gives students an explanation, if you actually explain a concept to someone, you wouldn't give the same explanation over and over again to student after student. What would happen is that you'd naturally vary how you explain concepts. And this would allow you to learn over time which explanations are better than others. And would also let you learn how to personalize, whether simple or complex explanations might be better for learners with high or low levels of knowledge. So how do we actually build resources so that they're a lot more like real teachers, perpetually improving? So my approach to tackling this question is to reimagine randomized experiments to be collaborative, dynamic, and personalized. So when I think about doing human-computer interaction, HCI, and education research, what I try to do is take a resource, whether it's an online lesson, an explanation, or motivational message, and think, how do we design randomized experiments? How do we come up with the conditions? How do we decide how to measure outcomes? And to this, I draw on my PhD in cognitive science. But I also work with instructors. So in my postdoc at Stanford, I focused a lot on working with instructional designers, where we can co-design these experiments so that they're hitting practical goals, as well as applying basic theories. And then we deploy these experiments to figure out what's helping people. But if we want to actually improve or help practical outcomes, what we need to do is change these experiments while they're running. So you can imagine that we actually analyze data from the first 20 people, the first 30 people, and we actually change randomization based on what we're seeing. So if you see, for example, that condition A might be better than condition B, then you might actually assign it to the next 30 people with 60% probability versus 40. Then you analyze more data. Now you might assign it with 70% probability of people getting A versus 30. And so what happens over time is you can converge to showing people what's best. So you can actually turn any experiment into an engine for enhancement, where there's one condition, one message, one explanation that's best for everyone. But also, you can go beyond that to think about personalization. maybe there's subgroups of people for whom one explanation is better than another. So to achieve this dynamic improvement, I draw on Bayesian statistics and machine learning. In my PhD, I applied machine learning to model cognition, but now I actually apply it to build systems so that while we're running experiments, we can analyze data in real time. But there's one other thing missing to make this an engine for improvement, and that's that we have to keep adding conditions. Whenever we get new ideas, as we collect new data, we have to be able to add in new experimental conditions to test these out. And to do this, I draw on work from crowdsourcing and human computation, where you might involve students or instructors in continually generating new ideas. So to achieve this vision, when I first try to run experiments in settings like Khan Academy or edX, often it's hard enough to just run experiments. You can't often apply machine learning or keep adding new conditions. So I've actually developed a software framework, which I call MOOClets, that basically provides a backend so that if any of you want to run an experiment, you could actually plug into this. And it would guarantee you that you could keep adding new conditions while the study was going, and also that you could get data in real time and use these machine learning algorithms. So I call it a MOOClet, but really you can apply it to any kind of experiment. As long as you have multiple versions that you want to present, you could use this framework. And just to give you a quick flash, the kind of key idea is that if you have a piece of a learning interface, like a resource, like an online lesson or problem, what it means to make that a MOOClet is that you can assign people to different versions of that, different explanations, different problems, by actually specifying a policy, which could be assign them with equal probability, or it could be personalizing. And separately to that, you can add in conditions. So you sort of abstract out where the machine learning person might work on the policy, but the instructors and psychologists could come up with the conditions. And independently, you've also got the data that's being flowed in real time. So basically a set of APIs and abstractions so that you can get the flexibility I was referring to previously. We can keep adding new conditions and analyzing data in real time. I'm happy to talk later, but this is available as open source code. It's a Python Django web app. So to give an overview, I started this vision of how do we make perpetually improving systems that improve the way a real teacher does. And my approach is to reimagine experimentation to be collaborative, dynamic, and personalized. So I'll now present one example of a system like that. We call the Adaptive Explanation Improvement System. And what this does is try and crowdsource explanations from students while they're learning, and then use machine learning to figure out which explanations are helpful. And this produces explanations that help learning just as much as those from a real instructor. I'll then talk about some recent work on instructor-centered experimentation. How do we actually involve instructors in the process of designing experiments? And I'll talk about future directions and how we can apply this to motivation and reflection. And especially fertile ground is continually improving online problems or quizzes. I'll give one example of how we can use experiments to discover how to personalize. And I'll touch on a few future directions that I'm interested in, especially on student self-regulation. How do we get learners to set goals more effectively? How do we get them to acquire new learning strategies? And then how do we teach them things like cognitive behavior therapy so they can actually learn the skills of managing their emotions and stressors? I think the key approach in all of this is to try and use things like MOOClets to connect instructors, behavioral scientists, and machine learning researchers. And in general, I'm interested in any way of applying experiments. So as you're listening to me talk, you might think about how would you apply experiments in any of the settings you care about? Because I'd love to hear ideas from people on that. So I'll start off with this system for crowdsourcing explanations. So the kind of key idea here is that when students are solving online problems, often they can attempt them without really getting it, without making progress or understanding what the key ideas are. One thing that's been shown to be helpful is to give them high-quality explanations that might highlight the key principles of solving a problem. But if we want to improve these explanations, we've got to be able to experimentally compare them. If you look at many online courses, instructors hardly have time to write one explanation. So how are we going to get them to write multiple versions? Well, actually, this is going to build on past work I've done and that many other people have looked at, which is, what if we ask students to try and explain their reasoning? Because this benefits students, it helps them reflect. But their explanations might be helpful for other people. And so this might be a mechanism for continually adding new conditions. And then we'd actually have to test out and see which student explanations are actually helpful. So this is a paper from Learning at Scale 2 years ago. So the key idea here is that we give students an online problem, like this one on expressions in algebra. Eventually, they're given the answer, and then we give them an explanation for why this answer is correct. This is what the MOOClet is. This is what we're going to be dynamically experimenting on and trying to improve. So that explanation comes from a current pool. To try and assess it, we ask students, how helpful was the information above for your learning? On a scale from 0, completely unhelpful, to 10, perfectly helpful. So if you're skeptical of subjective reports, I was too. And so you can kind of see how, in this case at least, these subjective judgments do seem to actually track the quality of explanations. We then ask students, to help you learn, explain in your own words why the answer is correct. And this helps them reflect, but you can see that we're being a bit sneaky here, right? If they give an explanation that's above 50 characters, and they check a box saying they'll be helpful for other people, we actually add this into our current pool. So their explanation gets passed to the next learner. So now we have this challenge, which is, how do we figure out which explanations are good? And in real time, trying to provide them to future people. So I'm going to frame this as what's called in machine learning, in particular reinforcement learning, as an exploration-exploitation trade-off. And in particular, the model I'm using here, you can Google, it's a very simple one. It's been very successful in online testing. Google and Facebook use these on you all the time. It's called a multi-armed bandit. And the key idea here is that we have a set of actions we want to take. For example, which explanations we present to people. We then want to optimize a reward or an outcome. For example, rating. How helpful is the information on a scale from 0 to 10? So we want to choose explanations that are highly rated. So the idea is that we start off exploring, testing out many of them, but as soon as we have data, we want to exploit it. We want to give people the highest rated explanation. So what we need is an algorithm in real time that provides a policy. For person 5, for person 15, what explanation should be assigned to them? In this context, we use an algorithm called Thompson sampling, which you can think of as randomized probability matching. What I mean by that is that it's essentially weighted randomization. So instead of presenting people 50-50, you might see numbers like 50% of people, when person 10 gets an explanation, there's a 15% chance they're assigned to explanation 1, 65% to explanation 2, and 20% to explanation 3. So now, where do these numbers come from? Actually, the whole point of this algorithm is it computes the probability that that explanation is the highest rated, based on the data we've seen so far. So the idea is that every point in time, we have some estimate of what's the probability this is the best condition. And we basically use that probability to randomize people. And so we need a model for that. And I'm happy to go into depth. For the people who are statistically or computationally inclined, the key idea here is that we model the quality of explanation with a beta distribution. So the probability of an explanation being rated as helpful follows a beta distribution with some prior parameters, in this case 19 and 1. And then the likelihood function follows a binomial distribution with 10 samples, where the probability of success is drawn from this beta distribution. So to give you an intuitive sense of what that means, when you actually start off this experiment, we act as if every student has given an explanation. There's been one rating of 9 and one rating of 10. Then let's say the first student rates explanation 1 and 8. That's as if the student gave it 8 thumbs up and 2 thumbs down. Then another student comes along and rates it a 6. That's like 6 thumbs up and 4 thumbs down. So what we basically do is we use Bayesian inference so that every step we keep updating our estimate of what the true rating of this explanation is. And so this kind of computation is complex to write out, but in this setting, because the algorithm we use, we're actually able to implement it in JavaScript code that just runs in the browser. And the kind of key idea you want to take away from all this is that we're basically estimating what's the true rating of this explanation relative to all the others. And that lets us compute, well, what's the probability it's the highest rated? So we deployed this with 150 people. And the goal was to choose a size that's about a large undergrad class, or maybe a class offered twice. Because I'm looking for methods that will work not just for people in MOOCs with thousands, but any instructor can actually have a system that might work for the smaller sample sizes they deal with. So at the beginning, there's no explanations. People are just solving problems. Then, eventually, students generate an explanation. It gets added to the loop. Then there might be 2 explanations that are randomized 50-50. And then over time, as we get people's ratings, some explanations are higher rated than others. So these are presented more frequently, like 2080. And so this is constantly updating. We keep adding new conditions, and we keep collecting data to figure out which ones are higher rated. So at the end, what you end up with is a probability distribution over all the explanations we've collected. Now, it doesn't look like this. It's not that there's one best one for sure. What you actually get is that there are a bunch of different explanations, some with reasonably high ratings, like 80%, 22, and then some with very low probability being presented, like 1% or 2%. So what we end up with is actually a set of explanations that some are presented more frequently than others because they're higher rated. But you might be asking, does this actually approach give us explanations that help learning more? To evaluate that, we did a separate study. We had a separate group of about 500 people who were randomized to either get just the original problems with no explanations, to get the problems where they were given explanations from Axis, from that system, that had been crowdsourced from learners and then dynamically experimented on. So we can see which of these actually leads to greater learning. We also compared this to filtered explanations, which means explanations that the system gave less than 5% probability, so they were filtered out. And as a gold standard, we compared that to explanations that we had the actual instructor write. So to understand the impact, what I'm going to show on the vertical axis is accuracy increase from a pre to post test. So people would come in, they'd do a pre-test where they'd solve some geometry and algebra problems. Then they'd either get the original problems or the original problems with Axis explanations. Then they'd do a post-test where we could then actually measure how much did they actually increase in their ability to solve problems as a function of the condition we assign them to. So what does this show us? The explanations from this system help learning significantly more than the original problems. Even though these were generated by actual learners, just for their own purposes, once you run them through this dynamic experimentation algorithm, we're able to pull out explanations that are higher rated and also lead to greater learning. So the skeptics in the audience might say, well, of course, that condition has explanations, and of course, something is better than nothing. So to all of you skeptics, what about the filtered explanations? These were explanations that the system assigned less than 5% probability. Actually, getting these lower rated explanations is like getting nothing at all. It's not any explanation that helps. It's actually those that were selected out by this algorithm. Now, one question to you, how good would this have to be for this to be worthwhile compared to a real instructor? Does it have to be 50% as good, 30% as good? Actually, there isn't a significant difference between explanations from the system and those written by a real instructor. They don't differ significantly in how much they impact learning. So you might even ask yourself, well, when will instructor explanations be better than those coming from students? And when might they be worse? Because sometimes students might actually have better insight into what other people are going to be confused about. I think this is a great direction for future research. So to some of the key contributions of this work, the kind of key idea here is what we call learner sourcing. So you might have heard of crowdsourcing, but this is coming from learners. And they're not doing it for money. They're doing it for their own self-interest reasons. They're just reflecting and explaining why they're solving problems. But that's a way of actually pulling out outcomes or information that we can actually use to help future people. It's an example of how we use dynamic experimentation to actually take data and put it into practice to help future learners. And I really think this is just the first step. There's a wide range of different systems you can build with these principles. For example, this is limited because we actually haven't given a way for the teacher to have input into the system. And the next work I'll present is actually allowing teachers themselves to author explanations. But also, might teachers be able to simply give us data to rule out some explanations that might be misconceptions and make sure they're not presented to learners. Another setting is thinking more broadly about things like recommender systems. So if we think about actually people watching a video, suppose we pop up a question, like, what's the key assumption of naive Bayes? So someone answers this question just because it's part of the learning activity. But now you actually have a question and answer pair that could be put onto a discussion forum. So we've got a much richer kind of interaction here where we can learn a source from people while they're answering questions. and then test out which of those answers are actually helpful for students when they've got a similar kind of question. So this segues nicely into what I think of as how do we actually think about systems for instructor-centered experimentation? How do we involve instructors in letting them run experiments? And the key motivation for this is that I've run a lot of experiments with instructors, and they often find that it's not necessarily addressing their core concerns. It's not clear to them how these experiments are actually going to improve practice in their classes, and they often don't feel very empowered to be involved in the design. So this is a Kai paper presented this year. They'll be presented this year in 2018. And the key idea is let's build a system, a tool for instructors to do experiments on online problems, where they can just plug into their on-campus course or MOOC or anywhere they like, and they can actually, without any programming experience, design different experiments. So one key part is that 3 Harvard instructors actually had this system that they deployed in Canvas, which is Harvard's learning management system. And so they plug it in, and when they go to this page, students just see an online problem. It's business as usual. But instructors actually now see an interface where they can actually edit what shows up after students solve the problem. So in the previous section, I talked about explanations that would show up after people entered the answer, and instructors were given the option to change what showed up there. So one instructor wrote different explanations, like a computational one versus one based on analogy. But instructors actually were pretty creative. Another instructor actually wrote different feedback messages. So after you had to enter your answer, you could get different messages, kind of prompting you. For example, remember to review your notes on differentiation of functions. So in a way, instructors can actually have a lot more creativity in how they do this. But the key part is they can actually just go in and design these themselves. What they can also do, however, is they don't have to analyze the data in real time, because that's where we use these methods of dynamic analysis. So that while the experiment's running, we're looking at students' ratings of what's helpful, and we're automatically giving the higher rating conditions to future students. So this is one example where instructors wrote an answer, a hint, or a full solution, and they can actually now view a dashboard to show that data. So for the instructor who wrote a quantitative explanation versus one based on analogy, they would see things like, here's the mean student rating, 7.2 versus 7.4, and how many students rated each of these. They've also got an interpretable dashboard in the sense that they know the machine learning algorithm is trying to choose what's higher rated, but they may not actually understand the function, so to avoid it being a black box, we're showing them the probabilities. There's a 23% chance right now of students getting the quantitative explanation, and a 77% chance of them getting the one based on analogy. So instructors don't have to monitor this because it's automatically giving the higher rating conditions. But at any point in time, they can actually see the data that this is based on. They can see how the algorithm is behaving. One thing we did that was very insightful is I actually asked instructors to rate, before the experiment started running, what they thought would be helpful. And in this case, actually, the instructors' ratings were opposite to what came out. They predicted students would prefer the quantitative explanation, when in fact, there was either no difference or even a trend that students preferred the explanation based on analogy. So what are the kind of key insights that came from deploying this with these 3 Harvard instructors? So they reported that actually this really lowered barriers, where they felt empowered to do experiments. I'm not aware of any tools that do this sort of thing, and even if I found one, I don't see that I have the technical expertise to actually incorporate it and run my own experiments. They found that just designing the experiment helped them reflect on their pedagogy. I never really seriously considered typing up multiple versions, as we're now doing. So even if we don't get any significant data, that will have been a benefit in my mind. So just the mere act of designing alternatives and thinking about what outcomes you'd measure can be professional development. They felt that this made research practical. This is a valuable tool. It puts in the hands of the teacher to understand how their students learn, not just in broad terms, but specifically in their course. And they found that it helped enable collaboration with the researcher, who was me in this case. You must know plenty of general things about how students learn, whereas I know specific things about how they get calculus. And finally, the fact that we had this machine learning algorithm that would actually deploy the best conditions made it clear to them how this wasn't just a research activity. It could actually help their students. This improved the experience of many of the students by giving them answers that are more helpful. So the earliest students can help improve the experience of the later students. That's pretty neat. Now, when we actually surveyed students about explaining to them that they were randomized to different versions and what their attitudes were, in general, students were very open to this. They appreciated that we were actually using their data to help the experience for future people. And one person said, well, I figure Facebook is doing this to me all the time to get me to click on the news feed. I'm glad you're actually using this to help improve my learning. Again, I think this is really just the first step. Many of you can probably already think, well, what are the kinds of experiments I might run? Or how might the instructors I work with test these ideas out? And two directions I think that are especially promising are thinking about how to enhance motivation reflection. And in general, how do we think of something like an online problem, which is just ubiquitous, as almost a lab or an engine for improving digital courses? So let me give you two examples of experiments that I've run that I think might give insight into the things that instructors can be working on. So these are experiments on problems, trying to enhance motivation and reflection. So motivational messages could be shown up above a problem, like every time someone's attempting a problem, do you say something to them before? And prompts to reflect might be asking someone, well, after you solve a problem, explain why this answer is correct. This was funded by an NSF grant that was all about how do we actually use online resources to bring psychological research into the real-world environments where it can actually impact instructional design. And what I like about looking at online problems, like these motivational messages, prompts to reflect and explaining, is this actually captures a lot of what a good coach or teacher would do. If you were there with a student while they're solving problems, you might give them motivational messages, you might ask them questions, or you might actually explain concepts. So this was a study that I ran in collaboration with Khan Academy. So they said, well, we'd like to actually increase students' engagement, get them to solve more problems. But you know what? Do that while making the minimum possible change to our code base. So what we looked at was actually just adding motivational messages about problems. So I presented a growth mindset message. For example, remember, the more you practice, the smarter you become. This is based on a theory of growth mindset from Carol Dweck's group at Stanford, and I collaborated with some of them. The key idea behind a growth mindset is that if you get students to believe that intelligence is malleable, then when they make mistakes or they struggle, they just see it as an opportunity to learn. This is in contrast to a fixed mindset, the belief that your intelligence is fixed, where every mistake, everything you do wrong is just a referendum on your ability. It's just evidence that you can't make it. So if you can foster a growth mindset, people reinterpret failure, and it's been shown to have huge effects in their persistence. So we compared giving a growth mindset message to practice as usual, no message at all. But also, I included an encouraging message. So this is a control condition where we'd say something like, some of these problems are hard, so do your best. So it's actually quite carefully matched the growth mindset in terms of being positive. And in fact, when we showed these to other people, they just predicted no difference at all. But what's actually the consequence on students' engagement? The growth mindset message led to people attempting significantly more problems than either practice as usual or encouraging message. There was a 1% increase in how many problems they attempted. In fact, the encouraging messages were no better than practice as usual. They were like showing nothing at all. And I think you can kind of see the theme here that when we use these psychological theories, changes that look unimportant or microscopic can have huge effects on people's behavior. I thought this was a really small effect, but because it was conducted in a real-world setting, it generated internal interest at Khan Academy, and they actually launched this You Can Learn Anything campaign, where they send messages to millions of learners, encouraging them to believe that they could actually learn anything with enough effort. And they also invited other researchers to propose similar experiments. Now, to make an effort to actually have a bigger effect on learning, what I tried to do was look at cognitive factors. For example, if we ask students questions that help them reflect, maybe we're changing the way that they're actually thinking about or comprehending information. That can have a bigger effect. And so here I drew on research for my dissertation, where I developed this theory of self-explanation, that when you ask someone to explain why, it's forcing them to help find patterns. Sorry, one sec. So the key idea here is that when I ask you to explain why an answer is correct, it's forcing you to think about that answer as an instance of a general pattern. So we gave people problems again, and eventually they'd be told the answer. And then they were randomized to either be in the explain condition, for example, explain why this answer is correct, versus the right thoughts condition. Write any thoughts you have about this answer. Again, very subtle difference. They both involve verbalization and spending time engaging. But explaining why we would hypothesize is based on this theory that it's going to force people to look for underlying principles and patterns. So to evaluate the effect, we administer a pretest where people solve problems. Then they'd be assigned to either explain future problems or write thoughts. Then they give a post-test. So again, we can measure what's the pre to post learning gain as a function of explaining versus writing thoughts. So if you look at the accuracy increase from pre to post, there's a significant advantage of prompting people to explain. Students reported that it really helped them understand the logic behind it, so you're more able to solve similar problems. And talking out really helps. I'll try and use that strategy for other problems besides math. Now, these are just illustrations of how, in the future, we could actually think about perpetually improving online problems by testing out which explanations or hints we provide people, which prompts to reflect or questions we ask them, and what motivational messages we provide. My approach now is that any psychological theories are a great constraint, they're a great starting point, but we really need to actually deploy this in the field and test out these precise ideas about what's going to help different students, especially in different contexts. Thinking about context, let me give you one example of how you can use experiments to discover how to personalize. The setting here was trying to send emails to people in a MOOC at Harvard, where the instructor wanted to get students to give some feedback about why they weren't participating in a course. So I'll just show you one comparison where we'd send people an email trying to get them to take a survey to give information about why they hadn't participated, and there was either a brief introduction or one that mentioned the fact they'd been absent. So what I'm showing on the vertical axis is response rate as a function of the brief message or the mentioned absence. So what do we see there? Well, actually, there's no significant difference. So maybe you should just give up and go home. But actually, once you break it down by subgroups, by people who are low activity, they've been active for 0 or 1 days, versus those who've been high activity, they've been active for 2 days or more. What you see is that the brief message was actually better for people who'd had low activity, and the mentioned absence is better for people with high activity. Possibly because they wanted to justify why they'd recently been inactive. So you see this kind of interaction where now the optimal thing is actually to give people different conditions based on activity levels. And we calculated that if we'd actually personalized by giving low activity message people the brief message and high activity mentioned absence, this could have increased response rates by 14%. So the idea is that we're not changing what we're doing to people. We're not adding more conditions. We're actually just figuring out through analyzing the data what's best delivered to who. And this is just already an illustration. I think there are many interesting directions here. When we actually run these experiments, what we're trying now is to do much more complex settings where we might test different subject lines, different intro messages, different bodies. So it's much more high-dimensional experimentation. And we can look at contextual features like people's age, how many days they're active, what country they're from, what they've been doing in the course. And just to give you a quick intuition for what this looks like, the kind of key idea here is that we randomize different groups, but then we actually change the probability of randomization based on people's response rates. I can talk about this more, but the key idea is that instead of sending people 33% probability, you might change it to 48%, because we have evidence that people in that particular age group are more likely to respond to a particular kind of subject line. So I see all of this that I present as really just a first step towards future research. And in particular, some directions I'm interested in have to do with student self-regulation, which I'll touch on briefly. But I'm very interested to hear what people have to say about what they think this would be useful to apply to. So the idea here is, how can we foster student self-regulation? For example, by giving them activities to set goals, helping them learn study strategies like ask themselves questions, or helping them learn strategies to regulate their mental health or emotions. So this is an internal grant that I've gotten where we're now actually trying to test out activities to help students set goals. So they kind of get these activities either by messaging or email or when they feel like they need it, that will help them think through their goals and obstacles. For example, what do you want to get done the next day? To make sure everything goes right, think about the obstacles you'll face. So we can experiment on exactly what questions we ask different people. where some people may need very general prompts and others need more specific ones. So right now we're looking at which of these are most engaging. And then the next step is to think which of them are actually increasing follow-through. Another setting here is how do we actually help students to study more effectively? In particular, getting them to ask reflective questions while they're reading. So this is a module I've developed and we want to test out where we give people like a 20-minute module teaching them while you're reading, you need to be active by asking yourself questions. And here are examples of questions you can ask. We want to then complement this with actually situational activities. So there's been lots of work showing that you can try and teach people general strategies, but they often don't apply it in a specific context. So technology can be a bridge for that. For example, if we give people these links, they can just go to that URL, tiny.cc/RQS. They pop it open, and it starts to ask them questions. When you're reading paragraphs on the material, this tool can guide you through questions to ask yourself. It can provide you reminders. For example, before you read paragraphs, you might ask yourself, what prior topics and experiences are relevant to what I'm about to learn? So again, this is a paradigm where we can think about these tools as helping students apply strategies in the moment about what questions to ask themselves while they're watching videos, while they're reading text, or while they're solving problems. And finally, tying in with the other work I've done in the past with clinical psychologists, how do we teach students learning strategies for mental health, for regulating emotions? And you can think about this as really thinking about, well, what's the entire student? How do we think about them holistically? You can also think about it from an efficiency perspective. If you have 10 hours with a student, do you want to spend 10 hours on content and 0 on skills? Or might you spend 9 hours on content and 1 hour so that you can teach them to manage stress? Because what that might mean is that they're much less likely to procrastinate assignments, that when they're anxious about activities, they're more likely to sit down and actually make plans. And as I mentioned, I've done this work before on helping people with depression learn cognitive behavior therapy. Another approach we're looking at is actually having peer counseling, where we can teach pairs of students just active listening strategies so that they can talk each other through stressful situations. And just thinking about an activity again, if you think about these apps that might help people reflect on their emotions, you can again think about, well, let's ask them reflection prompts to explain what they're thinking about, just like shown previously. Let's give them motivational messages or reminders about what activities to take next. And I think what's kind of exciting here is that there's a growing recognition that a lot of these problems we think of as biological or emotional might actually have psychological or technological solutions if we can help people learn how to change their behavior. I think that what runs through all of this work is really just this idea that we can use dynamic experiments to connect instructors, behavioral scientists, and machine learning researchers. So I really see experimentation as a common language. Instructors understand how they can test different versions of resources or interactions. Social behavioral scientists can move out of the lab into a real-world context. And the many machine learning researchers can actually start to apply their algorithms to this real-world problem. How do you figure out what's working best for different people? So just to review what I've gone through so far. I started on this vision of perpetually improving systems. How do we make something as simple as an online problem more like a real teacher, where it keeps testing out new strategies and figuring out what's working for different people? My approach to this is to reimagine randomized experiments so that we can make them collaborative, dynamic, and personalized. I gave one example of a system where we would crowdsource from students explanations, which would help students reflect. But we could then take those explanations and give them to future students, using machine learning to figure out which explanations were higher rated than others. And the outcome of this was explanations that helped learning just as much as those from a real instructor. I presented a Kai paper on instructor-centered experimentation. Let's provide tools to instructors so they can actually run experiments in a way that advances their practice. And I gave several examples of fruitful directions, such as studies I've done on motivational messages in Khan Academy, using growth mindset, or figuring out which questions can help people reflect, that why questions could actually help boost students' learning. I think there's a great deal of research here, especially in online problems, where you can do a lot of very flexible things that make them more like real tutors or coaches. I gave one example of how we can use experiments to discover how to personalize. For example, showing that the motivational emails we send would work better for low activity versus high activity people. And we can actually enhance responses by personalizing these. And I give several examples of future directions on student self-regulation, helping students set goals better through interactive activities online, teaching people learning strategies like asking themselves questions while they're reading. And finally, helping them learn techniques from cognitive behavior therapy so they can apply it to stress or emotions that they face in their studies. And in general, I'm really excited to hear people's thoughts on how we can actually use these approaches and these kind of software frameworks I've built to connect instructors with social behavioral scientists and machine learning researchers. Thanks so much. Yes, we use online math problems, yes.
Okay. Are you familiar with Baruti and Starr's work on conceptualization and mathematical knowledge?
Is that John Starr?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm not sure. I mean, I know of some of his work. What are you thinking about in particular?
Well, I'm wondering how you account for differences between students' conceptualization and instructors' conceptualization of mathematical knowledge, because certainly a lot of students will target some conceptualization that's below what many of us who are teaching mathematics will want them to achieve. So how do you account for that?
Yeah, I think if I understood the question, it's basically, well, students and instructors might have different conceptions of what they should be learning from math. And in particular, students may not match the high quality expectations of instructors. I think it's a great question. I think this system doesn't exactly address that. It more shows, here's a proof of concept for where whatever students' conceptions are, you can actually get some pretty good explanations out of students that can be helpful to other people. But I think it's a great question to look at as we continue through this work. So when is it that students will actually be giving better explanations than instructors because they understand the misconception, the difficulties other students have? Whereas when will instructors actually be giving better explanations than students because they've actually got a better sense of where students need to be? So I think that's a great broad, that's a good 5-10 years of research at least. So, but it's great. But here's one kind of quick thought. If students are coming up with a robust misconception, for example, if they think that multiplication is actually about multiplication of fractions, you can just add up the numerators, that's an instance where this kind of system will actually really go astray. Because there's a misconception that students keep coming up with and that they think is very compelling. So other students will keep voting it out. So that's why actually you need instructor-centered experimentation. Instructors need to be able to step in and say, I know there's data that students find this helpful, but actually that's bad. So we actually need to have the instructor either take explanations out or enter their own in. Another thing you could do is instead of optimizing for learning ratings of helpfulness, maybe that's where you need to include things like learning games. In this setting, there was so much variability in learning outcomes that it wasn't the best way to optimize explanations. But in other settings, that would definitely be something that I want to do.
I would wonder actually what you said is basically more suitable when you have a precise answer exist for a question. Mm-hmm. But in some circumstances, particularly in business and other law things, where you wouldn't have a particular answer to actually a particular question. So you have alternative answers. So when you have alternative or multiple answers, when you have limited students cohort to rate these instructions, sometimes a funny answer may actually get rated up, which may not be precise. But so that actually creates challenges for some other people who are maybe in this audience. I think it's a great tool, I agree, but similarly, the rating of the tools you mentioned about these Google and others can actually provide information that is not relevant. So that is actually when you have instructor coming in and saying this is the correct answer, that actually can be filtered out. But when the instructor says these are all correct answers, and how do you justify that answer is the most important things, and how in that circumstance I like to thoughts on how we can actually sort that problem out. Thank you.
Yeah, I think there's a question here. Oh, so yeah, I think that's a great point, which is these are settings where maybe there's some notion of what the kind of best answer is, and how do you handle these multiple answer cases. I think one thought here is that what's important is not that there's necessarily a best answer, but you have some metric of what quality is. So maybe there can be multiple good answers, but you still need some way of measuring. It may be students' judgments, it may be students' learning gains, or it may be instructors' judgments. But I think you're right, we do need to figure out how we come up with those metrics. I would say the metrics don't have to be perfect, but they just have to show, discriminate between A, B, and C. If A is a bit better than B, as long as the metric can pick that up, then I think this kind of approach can be useful.
Hi. Do you have any data on the amount of monitoring that an instructor would be doing compared with, say, managing something like a discussion forum or a more traditional digital way of managing information?
Yeah, so I heard the question is, can I speak to how much more extra work it is for an instructor to monitor like a system that's testing out explanations compared to discussion forum? That's a great question. I think right now it's pretty minimal for the instructor because they actually weren't involved in intervening. Because you've got this algorithm that's basically, the instructor essentially says, optimize for ratings of explanations. And the system actually does that. It presents high rated things more frequently. So the instructors here didn't feel that they had to check in very often. So that was pretty minimal. But I think that if you want to think of using this in a richer setting, for example, can we actually use this to test out which student answers to discussion forum questions are helpful, then that might actually raise the workload for instructors. It's kind of like as much as they want to be involved right now. They could check every single time and say, okay, no, I don't like that rating, add this explanation in. Or they could totally ignore it. So it's kind of up to them.
Yeah. So I was thinking maybe there'd be a way of putting some sort of percentage on particular responses that would then affect the algorithm for future versions so that the instructor could be inputting in the same way that the students are. So you don't get a runaway incorrect answer as was discussed earlier.
Yes, so that's a great idea. So I think you're talking a bit about like what's called interactive machine learning or human-in-the-loop machine learning, where how do you help people interact with an algorithm? And that would actually be a nice extension, which is instructors might give their ratings. Yeah. So they can privilege some explanations over others. I think that would be a really nice setting to see, well, when is that an effective strategy? When should instructors not do it? And that would be a great example of systems that don't take the instructor out, but actually allow them to do more than they could do if they were just teaching on their own.
Yeah.
Did you treat students that got the answer correct or incorrect equally?
Yeah, that's a great question. So if students got the answer right or wrong, did we treat their ratings equally? In this system, we did. But you actually raise a great point, which is maybe students who actually got it right, we should actually be giving their ratings double weight because they know the correct answer.
And also to weed out if they got it wrong and you ask them for an explanation what they think is right, there's probably a bad explanation in the system.
Yes, so that's another point. Yeah, exactly. That's a great point. One thing that I just think we have to test empirically, and we didn't have enough data here, is that, remember, students who got something wrong, they might give a misleading explanation, but their ratings of which explanations are helpful might actually be better than students who got it right. Because if you think about it, the students who we need to help most are the ones who get things incorrect. And so what they find helpful might actually be more important than what students who get things right think. Because, for example, really complex explanations like these, good students may think they're good, instructors may think they're good, but they don't really help address the confusions that students who are now learning about a topic are trying to get.
If I can have another question. A lot of feedback that gets given around quizzes is about directing them back to the instructional resources and texts that they should be learning from in the first place rather than a definitive answer. How did you manage that? And also, at what point do you realise, well, the instruction, if the course is wrong, not necessarily this task?
Got you. Yeah, so in terms of, this is a great point. One of the instructors in our in deployment, actually, he said his experiment was comparing feedback messages like, this is wrong for this reason with, this is wrong for this reason. Also, go and look at this video on differentiation. So there actually, exactly like you said, the instructor was most interested in getting messages that would actually get students to change their behavior. And we did see some evidence students are more likely to do that. The broader issue of how would this give instructors insight into what they're teaching right or wrong, that's a tougher one. I think one thing that might be helpful is to actually show instructors the explanations students are writing. Because when students start to write explanations about why they think something is correct, it can give the instructor a lot of insight into really, oh, I realize students are totally on the wrong page. They think this is about multiplication, it's about division. So maybe that's a setting where instructors can get insight into how to change the instructional design.
We have time for one more question.
Yeah, we've got a question from Hongmai Online. Can instructors customize the settings to accommodate different topics?
Yes, so can instructors do different topics? Yes. So online problems are simple, but what I like about them is that they can be in anything, right? So if you have a literature course, you could write your question like, how would you analyze William Blake's discussion of, songs of the innocence and experience? And then here's some explanations that other people gave. So you can actually put your own content in, and you can decide what things we're comparing, but also what's the metric you want to evaluate them on. For example, maybe you don't want to think of how correct something is. Maybe it's more, how much did this give you insight into this essay? And so that's actually a rating that's can be quantitative, but it's giving insight into people's experience or what they found helpful about a particular topic.
And if you have any questions for Joseph, I'm sure you can find him over the lunch break, and you can have a chat with him then. Please join me in giving a round of applause to Joseph.